All right, everyone. Good evening. Um, it's a huge pleasure and privilege for me to say a few words at the start of this evening. I'm Andrei Magashoyo, and we are about to start the seminar speaker series for the Theoretical Philosophy Department at the University of Bucharest. And this is in partnership with CELFIS, which is the local center for the philosophy and history of science. And I should say, since I've had the pleasure to organize this meeting tonight, that the logistics of it are also, and by that I mean just the online meeting, are also supported by a project that's financially supported by the local state agency sponsoring research, namely WEFISCDI, through a project that has the following code PN3 P1-1.1-PD 2019-0535, and it's quite a pleasure to acknowledge their support. We have a fantastic first speaker. Derek Lamb is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. His main research is in the philosophy of agency, philosophy of mind, epistemology, philosophy of time, metaphysics perhaps more broadly in the Anglo-Saxon world. And Derek is going to talk to us today about dialectic delicacies in arguing for agential knowledge. And I should say that this talk itself is quite a delicacy for us all. And so, Derek, please take it away, and we're very happy to have you.
Right. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you guys. Let me, start the presentation. So, as I mentioned to Andre a little bit earlier, well, I'm honored to be here. And I'm going to present this talk at the APA later this year. So this is the first time ever I present this talk. So I'm looking forward to your feedback and advice so I can make this talk better, make the paper better. And let me start my PowerPoint first. I think it would work. All right, can you see the slides?
It's starting, yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so here's a roadmap of, and also this is the first time I present a paper online. So if at any point either the phone is not working or it's not clear, please stop me and let me know. All right, so here's a roadmap of my talk. So first of all, I'm going to introduce the phenomenon that I'm interested in, which is about self-knowledge, as I'll say a few words more later on. And then I'm going to introduce a particular approach introduced by Tyler Birch about self-knowledge with the concept of epistemic entitlement. So Birch has a particular view on self-knowledge using a concept called epistemic entitlement. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And then I'm going to talk about how recently some philosopher in philosophy of action, theory of action, has tried to deploy or apply Birch's approach to theory of action and try to understand self-knowledge in agency in philosophy of action. So basically, Birch has something to say about philosophy of mind. People in philosophy of action try to borrow that approach in philosophy of action. I'm going to articulate how they're going to approach that, borrow that approach. Fourth, I'm going to present a dilemma for this approach. So this is the main goal of the paper. The main goal of the paper is a negative one. I'm trying to show that this approach should borrow a view from philosophy of mind into philosophy of action. This view about epistemic entitlement faces a dilemma. First of all, I'm going to talk about how their main argument failed to prove that we have epistemic entitlement for self-knowledge. And then I'm going to explain why I think that the argument also failed to be a good explanation of the kind of epistemic entitlement they are talking about. So the dilemma I'm going to present is They have an argument for epistemic entitlement for action, but that argument is neither good proof for the kind of entitlement they are interested in, nor does that argument serve as a good explanation of the kind of entitlement they are talking about. So that's why it's unclear what that argument is for. So that's a kind of a dilemma I'm going to present. Finally, I'm going to address briefly to see whether this kind of approach has a way out of this dilemma. So I presented a dilemma, and in the end, I wrap up by talking about whether, if I have time, it depends on whether I have time, I'm going to talk about whether there's any hope to save this approach to self-knowledge in philosophy of action. All right, so let's jump right into it. So suppose Andre performed the following intentional action. He puts pineapple on the pizza, of his pizza. So that's a terrible thing to do, but suppose he intentionally do that. Well, since it's an intentional action, we would say necessarily Andre knows that he's putting pineapples on his pizza. So that's part of what intentional action is. If a person performs an intentional action, that person knows that he's performing that action. If a person doesn't know he's putting pineapple on the pizza, we would say at least that action is not intentional. So intentional action is essentially tied to some kind of first-person knowledge. A person must know what he's doing if that action is intentional action. I call this kind of knowledge throughout this paper agential knowledge. This kind of first-person knowledge that an agent has about his own intentional action, I call it agential knowledge. Now, whether unintentional action also have some kind of first-person knowledge attached to it, that's another issue. I'm focusing on intentional action. And intentional action essentially consists of a person having agential knowledge. All right, so the next question about agential knowledge is that what's the relation between agential knowledge with observation? So one might think that here's the relation between observation and agential knowledge. A person like Andre who intentionally put pineapple on his pizza, one might say, well, he knows what he's doing because of his observation. He observed what he's doing, that's why he knows what he's doing. When I kick a table intentionally, I know that I'm kicking a table because I observe myself kicking a table. So you might say that. That's one way to think about the relation between your observation and your intentional action. But Anscombe famously in his book Intention points out that that is not true. An agent knows what he's doing, not because of observation. An agent doesn't need to use observation to know what he's doing. When Andre intentionally put pineapples on his pizza, he knows that, but he doesn't know that through observation. He doesn't need to observe himself to know what he's doing. Just like when I'm intentionally kicking a table, I know I'm kicking a table. That's first-person knowledge, agential knowledge, but I don't get to know that through my observation. Instead, from Anscombe's perspective, observation plays a different role in our intentional action. It plays a practical role. I use observation to help me perform my action properly. For example, if I'm spelling some words on a whiteboard, on a blackboard, I'm writing something on the blackboard, I have to use observation, but I use observation to help me make sure I'm writing things properly. Suppose I'm intentionally kicking a football. I use observation to help me do that, but the role observation plays is something that helps me perform my action properly. I don't use observation to help me know what I'm doing. Observation is something that helps me do things. It's not something that helps me know things in an intentional action. So that's Anscombe's view. And in this paper, I'm going to assume that Anscombe is right about that. Here's the thing though. If this is right, that observation is not something that an agent relies on to gain knowledge about his own action. It leads to what recently John Schwengler called the self-knowledge problem for agential knowledge. So what's the problem? The problem is, for most of our intentional action, it's not purely in our mind. When a person put pineapples on the pizza, it partly involved the pizza and the pineapples out there in the world. And when I kick a table, it partly involves my foot and a table, which is out there in the world. When I intentionally punch people in the face, it involves partly my fist and people's face. So intentional action is partly mental, but also partly out there in the external world. Problem is, if we have any knowledge about things outside in the world, we would have thought that it has to be based on observation. But now if Anscombe is right, that an agent can have knowledge about his action without basing it on observation, that means it seems to think an implication is that we can have knowledge about something that's partly outside our mind, but somehow we can have knowledge about that without observation. The question is, how can we, well, knowledge is at least justified belief. So the question is, how can we have justification for forming beliefs about something external to us? So that's a problem, a dilemma Anscombe has to face. Action is partly outside us. We have non-observational knowledge about our action. That means we have non-observational knowledge about something outside of us. How could that be possible? So that's a self-knowledge problem. So again, the issue is not whether we have non-observational knowledge about our action that is external to us. The question is, assuming that we have that kind of knowledge, how can we have that kind of knowledge? So that's the problem we are facing. Now, in this paper, I'm interested in exploring one particular solution to this self-knowledge problem. And to understand this solution, I need to talk a little bit about the literature. So in the literature about self-knowledge, in philosophy about self-knowledge, there are actually two different literature. There's a literature in philosophy of mind, and there's a literature in philosophy of action. That is, there are two kinds of self-knowledge philosophers are interested in. Some philosophers are interested in self-knowledge of our mind, like how can we know things about our mind? When I believe something, I know that I'm having those beliefs. When I have certain emotion, I know that I'm having those emotions. So I have self-knowledge about our own mind. So some philosophers are interested in that kind of self-knowledge. And other philosophers are interested in another kind of self-knowledge about our intentional action, where when I'm doing something intentionally, I know that I'm doing that. So it's not exactly self-knowledge about the mind. So there are two different literature about self-knowledge out there in philosophy of self-knowledge. The particular approach that I'm interested in, that I'm going to explore and examine in this paper, is an approach that tries to borrow a theory in philosophy of mind of self-knowledge to apply it to the philosophy of self-knowledge in intentional action. So it's a particular approach that borrows something from philosophy of mind to philosophy of action. And more specifically, it is an approach that's trying to borrow something in philosophy of mind from Tyler Birch. So Tyler Birch has a specific theory about self-knowledge about our mind. So this approach trying to borrow it from Birch and apply it to a philosophy of action. All right, so to do that, I need to first say something about Birch's approach to self-knowledge about our own mind. So let me explain some detail. Excuse me. Suppose I believe that P. So I have a belief in my mind that P, whatever it is. If so, I know that I believe that P. It's rare that I believe something without knowing that I believe that. The question is, how can I know that? So it's clear there's no controversy about the fact that I know that I believe that P, but the question is how? We want to make sure we understand how. So that's the epistemology question. Well, Birch's answer is a person can know what he or she believes based on what he calls epistemic entitlement. So epistemic entitlement for Birch is a technical notion. People in epistemology use the term epistemic entitlement in various different ways. For Birch, it's a technical term that refers to epistemic warrant that comes not from evidence. So Birch distinguished two kinds of epistemic warrant. You can be warranted to form beliefs in two ways. First way is through justification. Justification is based on evidence. So that's one way you can have warrant for belief and have knowledge. The other kind of way you can have epistemic warrant for your belief, according to Birch, is by entitlement. A person could be entitled to form a belief for a certain kind of belief, a person could be entitled to form the belief, even if that person has no evidence for it, and even if that person has no intellectual or conceptual resources to understand why he's warranted to form the belief. One example is our perceptual belief. According to Birch, we have epistemic entitlement to form a belief based on our perception. And that is not a case where you form your belief based on perception as evidence, according to Birch, because he thinks that even a kid, a baby, is warranted to form belief based on his or her perception, even though the baby don't even have the concept of perception, don't know anything about perception, don't even know that, isn't even aware of the fact that he has perception. But yet, a baby, as long as it has perception, the perception put the baby in a position where it is warranted to form beliefs. So when a baby sees his mom, he's warranted to believe that it is his mom, even though he has no concept of perception to articulate why he can form beliefs based on perception. So that's why, from Birch's perspective, forming beliefs based on perception is epistemic entitlement. Perception give people entitlement to form beliefs. So in short, epistemic entitlement is warrant not based on evidence. So Birch says that I know that I believe that P because I'm entitled to form belief about my own mental states. Question is, you can't just say things like that. If philosophy is that easy, it will be life would be simpler for us philosophers. You can't just say that you're entitled to form belief, right? So Birch has to say something more to explain why does he think that we have epistemic entitlement to form belief about our mental states. So that's where Birch further developed his theory of self-knowledge. So here's roughly his idea. So we'll focus on the kind of mental states that is produced by critical thinking capacity. So I believe that P, right? So Birch's idea is this belief is a product of a critical thinking capacity. When I form belief, or when people form belief, at least for a majority of their belief, the belief is produced by their taking a step back and think about the situation they're in, what kind of belief they can form, think about the logic behind the belief. So they form the belief based on a critical thinking capacity, and this critical thinking capacity necessarily involve following rules with a kind of meta-level awareness. When you form a belief with critical thinking, critically, you have to take a step back from your belief and think about your belief. So that's essential to critical thinking, that you take a step back and think about your own belief. It's a very important part of critical thinking. So if that is true, according to Birch, that there are these mental states like belief that is formed by critical thinking capacity, and critical thinking capacity has to involve you taking a step back and look at what you're believing. That means these mental states, like my belief that P, could not have existed without my awareness of them. So let me repeat. So I have a belief that P, suppose Birch is right, that this belief is formed by critical thinking, and critical thinking necessarily involve me taking a step back and look at what beliefs I have, look at my own mind, taking a step back. Then that means if I form this belief in the first place, this belief must involve my awareness of it. I must be aware of this belief, otherwise I wouldn't be able to form it through critical thinking capacity. So if that is true, according to Birch, we have the following argument. So why do we have epistemic entitlement to form belief about our own mental states like belief? Here's an argument from Birch. Premise 1. Certain mental states are product of our critical reasoning, critical thinking capacity. So not all of them. For example, there are emotions. Suppose when I'm hungry, this emotion is not formed by my critical thinking capacity. I don't try to reason my way into hunger. No, but some mental states are product of critical reasoning. For example, my belief that P. Second premise, critical reasoning require self-awareness, meta-level awareness, requires to take a step back from our mind and look at our own mind. Conclusion, we are warranted, I shouldn't have used the word justified here, we are warranted to believe that we have these mental states. Because if we have no awareness of what mental states we are in, we would not be able to produce these mental states with critical reasoning capacity. That's why the conclusion. That's why we are entitled to form beliefs about these mental states. It has something to do with this essential connection between these mental states and our critical reasoning capacity, that these mental states has to be a product of critical reasoning capacity. So that's the reason why we have entitlement to form these beliefs, according to Birch at least. Not saying that he's right, as I'll explain later. Actually, I don't think this reasoning works, but this is Birch's view. All right, so we're done with philosophy of mind. To some recent philosopher in philosophy of action, they think that this approach to philosophy of mind that Birch introduced, based on epistemic entitlement, could be applied to philosophy of action as well. They think that a similar kind of epistemic entitlement could be found to support our belief about our intentional action. And some example is, for example, Lucy O'Brien in 2004 and 2014. More recently, Janis Luthra in Journal of Philosophy has a new article in 2017 on this idea as well. The idea is, just like in philosophy of mind, there's a similar connection between agency, rational agency, and our intentional action. Whereas Birch thinks that a certain kind of mental state has to be a product of critical thinking capacity, these philosophers think that our intentional action has certain connection with our rational reasoning capacity, practical reasoning capacity. And based on this connection, a similar approach to epistemic entitlement could be developed to explain why we can have self-knowledge about our intentional action. So how exactly could it work? So here's the idea, roughly the argument. And I'm going to focus on Luthra's version of this argument because I think his argument is the better version of it. But what I'm going to say apply to other people's version of the same approach. All right, here's the idea. First premise, they think that intentional action, whatever we do intentionally, it ought to be a product of our rational deliberation, our practical reasoning capacity. So the point is not that all our actions are product of our rational deliberation. The thought is it ought to be, it should be. It is a normative claim. First premise, a normative premise. Our intentional action should be a product of reasoning. Second, if one should do something, a person must have the permission or must be able to do all that is necessary in order to do that thing. So if one should do something, the person must be permitted to do that thing. Ought implies can. Basically, that's the idea. Third premise, rational deliberation, practical reasoning requires knowledge of its own product. The idea is when you have to think about what to do, when you are trying to produce an action through deliberation, you have to know what you're producing. Think about it this way, like a carpenter trying to make a table or make a chair out of a piece of wood. When he's doing that rationally, the carpenter has to have access to the product he's producing, the chair, so that when he's making the chair, he can make calibration and adjustments throughout the process. If the carpenter has no access to what the chair looks like, have no knowledge of the chair, you can't make a chair rationally. So when you want to make something rationally, you must have knowledge of the thing you're making. Otherwise, you can't adjust and calibrate what you're doing with the thing when you're making it. So rational deliberation is a process of creating action. And for that rational process to be possible, you must have access to what you're producing through this process. You must have access to the action you're producing. So that's third premise. You must be able to take a step back and know something about your action in order to shape your action. So that's the idea of premise 3. So with all these 3 premises together, Luther thinks that we have this conclusion. A person who performs intentional action must know what intentional action he or she is performing. Again, the reason is because this action should be based on our rational deliberation, and rational deliberation requires the person to know what they're producing. Otherwise, it would not be a rational process. To produce something rationally, a person must be able to know what they're producing so they can shape what they're doing. So that's why a person who performs intentional action must have the capacity to know what they're doing. And that is why a person is entitled to form belief about their intentional actions. So the conclusion is, if a person performs intentional action, he must know what he's doing. Otherwise, he would not be able to produce those intentional actions rationally. If that's the case, the person must have the entitlement to form belief about his action. So that's the thought. That's the reasoning process. And I call this, throughout this paper, I call this argument agentialist argument. All right, so let's take a step back and summarize what we got so far. So we have two different arguments here. So the first part of it is Birch's argument in philosophy of mind, and then on the other side we have Luther's application of the same kind of argument in philosophy of action. So on Birch's side, Birch is focusing on the connection between our critical reasoning capacity and our mental states, the mental state we form by critical reasoning. And on the other side, we have Luther, who's focusing on the connection between our practical deliberation, practical reasoning capacity, and the intentional actions that we produce by practical deliberation. So there's a connection between reasoning and a certain product. For Birch, it's a connection between reasoning and mental states. For Luther, it's the connection between practical reasoning and intentional action. From Birch's perspective, this connection is the reason why we are warranted to have first-person knowledge about our mental states. Because critical thinking produces these mental states, critical thinking requires us to have the capacity to take a step back and look at the mental state we're producing through critical reasoning. That is why we must have first-person knowledge of these mental states we produce by critical reasoning. So that's Birch's take in philosophy of mind. In parallel, Luther is saying, well, our intentional action should be produced by our practical reasoning, and practical reasoning requires us to be able to take a step back and look at the product of our practical reasoning. Otherwise, it's not proper practical reasoning properly. So that means if intentional action has to be produced by practical reasoning, practical deliberation, we must have the ability to take a step back and know what we're doing. That's why there must be first-person knowledge, and that's why we are warranted. We have entitlement to form belief about what we're doing. That's why, because these actions should be produced by our practical reasoning, and practical reasoning must involve taking a step back and look at what we're doing. So that's why we are entitled to form belief about our actions. So you can see there's a parallel in their approach, and basically Luther is borrowing Birch's approach in philosophy of mind to philosophy of action. All right, so that's basically the introduction of the relevant literature. And my question is the agentialist argument, the argument I just explained, a good argument to help us understand why we have non-observational knowledge about our intentional action? Andre, when he intentionally put pineapples on the pizza, he knows that he's putting pineapple on the pizza. Question is, why does a person like Andre know something about his intentional action? Is that argument we just saw earlier a good argument to help us understand why he's entitled to know that? Well, I would say no. I say that it is a poor argument for that purpose. And it's because that argument faces a dilemma. To understand the dilemma I have in mind, it's important to introduce a distinction. To say a little bit more about argument. So argument, when we have an argument for why P is the case, so in philosophy we have all sorts of arguments, but arguments serve two different kinds of purposes. Suppose you have an argument for P. You have an argument showing why P is the case. It could do two different things. One kind of argument is that it could be a proof that P is the case. So you can provide an argument for P as a proof that P is the case. That's one way argument can serve us. But at the same time, we can have an argument for P as an explanation of why or how P is the case. So let me give you two examples. So suppose I have an argument. Suppose, say, Andre's sick, for example, ill. And say I have an argument for that. Here's my argument. Premise one, Andre has a doctor's note showing that he's sick. So premise one, here's a doctor's note. Second premise, a person wouldn't be able to get a doctor's note unless he's really sick. Conclusion, Andre's sick. So that's an argument for the conclusion that Andre is sick. So this argument is a proof that Andre is sick. But it's not an explanation. If we know that Andre is sick, suppose Nora knows that Andre is sick, but she wants to know why. She wants to know the explanation of why Andre is sick. Doctor's note could not be an explanation. It is a proof that Andre is sick, but it's not an explanation of why he's sick. So it's an argument which is a proof, but not an explanation. Here's another argument for the same conclusion. Premise one, Andre drank the milk in the fridge. Premise two, the milk in the fridge has been expired for 2 months already. Premise three, anybody who drank milk which is expired would be sick. Conclusion, Andre is sick. Again, he drank the milk is expired, anybody who drank expired milk would be sick. Conclusion, Andre is sick. So this is also an argument for the conclusion that Andre is sick. But this argument is different. This argument can also serve as a proof. If a person is not sure whether Andre is sick, this argument could prove that Andre is sick. But different from the first argument, this argument can serve as an explanation of why Andre is sick. Suppose Nora knows that Andre is sick, but Nora wants to know why. Whereas the doctor's note cannot explain why Andre is sick, this argument about him drinking the expired milk could explain why Andre is sick. So I hope this shows that argument can serve two different purposes. Sometimes argument can be a proof, but not an explanation. In other cases, an argument can be both a proof and an explanation. So whenever we are presented with an argument in philosophy, I think it's important for us to take a step back and think about what that argument is supposed to do. Is the argument supposed to prove something to us, or is the argument supposed to explain something to us? I'm opening it. The question we are supposed to ask here is, these philosophers give us an agential argument, an argument for epistemic entitlement for self-knowledge. Is this argument supposed to be a proof or an explanation? What is this argument supposed to do for us? Well, what I'm going to say is it can do neither. That's the problem. The argument, as I'll show, can not be a proof. It's a bad proof. If it's a proof, it's a terrible proof. And it's also not an explanation. If it is an explanation, it's a terrible explanation. So that's a dilemma they have to face. All right, let's look at the argument again. This is Husserl's argument. So it's an argument trying to convince us, I suppose, that we have knowledge about our own intentional action. So again, our actions are product of practical reasoning, and practical reasoning requires to take a step back to have knowledge about the product of practical reasoning, and that's why anybody who performs intentional action must be able to know what they're doing. So that's the rough idea. So that's the argument. Is this a proof for the conclusion, or is it an explanation of the conclusion? So let's suppose we interpret this argument as a proof. Suppose it's trying to prove the conclusion is true. Suppose that's what the argument is about. Here's the problem, though. The conclusion we have here in this argument is just that a person who performs intentional action must know what action he's doing. But everybody knows that. Nobody need a proof for this conclusion. As I mentioned earlier, everybody in this literature knows that a person who performs an intentional action knows what he's doing. The question is why? The question is how? How can we get to know that? The question is not a question of that. Everybody knows that a person knows what he's doing. We don't need a proof for that. So that's why it seems that as a proof, if we interpret this argument as a proof, it would be a proof for a conclusion that nobody needs a proof for. It's an uninformative argument. This argument is so weak and uninformative if it is interpreted as a proof that even a person who thinks that we have self-knowledge based on observation can accept this argument, because all this argument has proven, if it is a proof, is proof that we have self-knowledge. But everybody knows that we have self-knowledge. Even if you think that your self-knowledge is based on observation, you would also think that there is self-knowledge. So as a proof, this argument is it is valid, but it is useless. It is not proving something that we don't already know. So that's why first horn of the dilemma, if we interpret this argument as a proof, it doesn't prove anything interesting. It's unclear what it is supposed to prove. What is supposed to be surprising about this conclusion? On the other hand, well, maybe you can say, okay, so maybe we should not interpret this argument as a proof. Maybe it is an argument that's supposed to explain why we have epistemic entitlement for our self-knowledge. So it's not a proof, it's an explanation. This argument is supposed to show us why we get to have this entitlement. Problem is, if we interpret this argument as an explanation, it is a terrible explanation. And to see why, I want to introduce the idea of an explanatory order. Here's some example of explanatory order. When we try to explain something causally, offer causal explanation, we always explain what happens earlier to explain what happens later. We can't revert the order. We are supposed to explain something that happens later with something that happens earlier. That's what causal explanation works. That's how it works. When you revert it, when you try to causally explain something that happens earlier with something that happens later, we would say you're messing up with the explanatory order. Another example, when you try to explain the existence of an abstract object, you use concrete object to explain it. You can't revert the order. You can't explain something that's concrete with something that's abstract. You have to explain something abstract with something that's concrete. For example, if we want to explain why there's this set of Socrates, to use Kit Fine's famous example, this abstract object, a set of Socrates exists. When we want to explain the existence of this abstract object, we use the concrete object, Socrates, to explain it. You can't explain it on the other way around. You can't use the abstract object, the set, to explain the existence of the concrete object. Well, I'm not saying that this is not controversial, but at least this is an intuitive way to think about it. You explain something abstract with something concrete. If you revert the order, one might be tempted to say you're messing up. You're messing up with the explanatory order. You're getting the explanatory order wrong. Third example, you explain normative fact with non-normative facts. For example, here's normative: a duty to save a drowning kid. A kid is drowning in the pond, I have the duty to save it. That's a normative fact. When we want to explain it, you explain it with some non-normative facts, like the fact that I can swim, the fact that I'm tall enough that I won't drown. These non-normative facts about my biology help explain why I have the moral duty to save a drowning kid. So we use non-normative facts to explain normative facts. And you can't do that in a revert order. You can't use normative fact to explain non-normative fact. You can't use what should happen to explain what is happening. I'll skip that example. The last example is terrible, so I'll skip that. So these are some examples of explanatory order. You are supposed to explain one kind of thing with another kind of thing, and you're not supposed to mix up the order. So why is that important? Because, look, here's another example of explanatory order. We have normative claim about ought, and we have claims about can. Let's assume that ought implies can. When a person should do something, the person can do something. So a claim about ought implies what a person can do. Now, I know there are philosophical debate about whether this is true. Let's assume that ought implies can. Still, even if we assume ought implies can, it's not true that, well, at least intuitively, it's not true that ought can explain can. So Spider-Man has responsibility implies that he can do something, but the fact that he has a responsibility to save the world does not explain his capacity to save the world. If I should save the kid, that implies I can save the kid. Because if I can't save the kid, I wouldn't have the duty to save the kid. But at the same time, my duty to save the kid is not an explanation of my ability to save the drowning kid. So ought implies can, logically, but ought does not explain our ability, does not explain can. So why is this important? Because it seems to me that the agentialist argument, I misspelled it on the slide. The agentialist argument seems to have mixed up the explanatory order in exactly this way. If we think about it, the whole argument is trying to, if interpreted as an explanation, is an attempt to explain our warrant to form belief about intentional action by appealing to the norm of intentional action. It says our intentional action should be produced by our practical reasoning. That's a norm. And the argument is trying to use this norm to explain why we are permitted to form belief about our intentional action. It's a claim about can. So it is an argument, if it is an explanation, it is an argument that's trying to explain what we can do with what we should do. It is trying to use an ought claim to explain a can claim. And that exactly is trying to mess up the order of explanation as I put it earlier. And that's why I said earlier, if the agentialist argument is interpreted as an explanation, it is a terrible explanation. So we have it here, is a dilemma. We are presented with an argument. An argument can either be a proof of something or an explanation of something. But the agentialist argument we are given here is neither a good proof. If it is a proof, it is a terrible proof because what it proves is something that's not surprising. Everybody knows that. We don't need a proof for. If it's a proof, it's an uninformative proof. But on the other hand, if we interpret it as an explanation, it is an explanation that tries to use a norm to explain what we can do, and it seems to be messing up with the explanatory order, getting the order wrong. So that's why it can't be a good explanation as well. But then the question is, what is this explanation for? What is this argument for then? It's unclear. So that's a dilemma the people who present this argument has to face. They have to say something more, what this argument is for. If it's neither a proof nor an explanation, what is it supposed to do in our conversation? And until they can say something more about that, the argument, it's unclear what the argument's contribution is in the literature of self-knowledge. All right, so in the paper I actually shared, I hope Andre shared the paper that I sent around. I say a little bit more about what I think a way out is for the people who accept this argument. Like if it's, what's a way out of this dilemma? But I don't think I have time for that. I'm happy to if we have time in the Q&A, but I'm going to skip that. And I do want to emphasize one thing though, is what my argument does not do. So sometimes people misunderstood the point of my argument. So by presenting this dilemma, I'm not trying to show that the whole idea that self-knowledge is based on epistemic entitlement is wrong. I'm not trying to challenge the idea of epistemic entitlement. What I'm trying to challenge is this approach to try to understand this epistemic entitlement through a connection with agency or reasoning capacity. So I'm challenging just one particular version of epistemic entitlement for self-knowledge. Actually, I was talking to Andre earlier before the talk. I have another paper where I develop a different approach to understand epistemic entitlement to self-knowledge. So I'm not challenging epistemic entitlement as such. I'm just trying to challenge one particular version of it. All right, so on that note, I will stop here and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say with this talk, and I'm happy to re-explain anything that's unclear. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first time ever I give a talk virtually online, so I'm sure there are a lot of places where I'm unclear that I need to re-explain. So if you have questions, suggestions, objections, advice, things I miss, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to address them. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Derek, for a wonderful talk. And I mean this literally, right? I think that's actually beautiful. So usually we stop recording after the talk. Would you like us to record the questions as well?
Well, it's up to you guys. I don't know.
Okay, we can keep going with the recording. Is that fine or okay? And that said, I believe that Professor Stefanov has a question. Is that right?
No, I was just saying that I'm okay with the recording going on.
Oh, okay.
But I do have a comment. I've read part of the paper which you are preparing, Derek, and there was a footnote in that paper where you seem to say, yeah, there is this other approach which privileges Anscombe's distinction between theoretical and practical knowledge and makes intentions equivalent to beliefs. But I'm going to discard that. So I had a question related to that because I mean I think there is this tension in what Anscombe says, because on one hand he talks about the direction of fit. In the case of knowing what one does, if you think there is actually practical knowledge there, and the direction of fit is from my action to the world, I cannot be wrong, right? I can be wrong in my performance. I cannot be wrong, but she still says, yeah, but this is contrary, or I don't know, in spite of what Wittgenstein says in Uncertainty, this could still be called knowledge because there might be some cases when I can be proven wrong. So there is doubt, or at least I can be proven wrong. But so it's not about forming beliefs about what I'm doing by observation, because I think Anscombe would grant that, would say, oh, if you form theoretical beliefs or beliefs which belong to theoretical knowledge, this sort of with the other direction of fit, of course you need to observe the results of your actions in order to form those sort of beliefs. But in order to know what you're doing, because you know what you intend to do, you don't need to make any sort of observations. Also, I think she also, this is just my interpretation, she tends to regard observations as actions, not as sense data. So she's also saying, yeah, of course, I might know what I'm doing because I have some sense data, but I'm not making any observations about what I'm doing. When I know what I'm doing in the case of practical knowledge. But I know you're actually addressing a different kind of argument, but I was curious because I'm more interested in Elizabeth Anscombe's. Yeah. I don't know if I made any sense. But there was one footnote in which you said you're going to leave aside a particular approach, and I was interested more in that.
So, so thank you very much. So yeah, the whole idea of direction of fit, of course, generated a huge literature. The idea, as you correctly point out, was in belief. We're trying to have our belief match the world. That's one direction of fit. And when it comes to intention, we're trying to have the world fit our world. We're trying to change the world to fit our intention. So it's a different direction of fit. So belief, intention seems to go different direction. World fit our, so we want to believe to fit the world, but we want the world to fit our intention. So is that a good reason for understanding why the knowledge is non-observational? Like why we have intention to perform an action, we don't need observation? Well, because we are trying to make the world fit us. That's why we don't need observation. So that's the reasoning. So my paper was not focusing on that, but I guess I can say a few words what I think about it on top of my head. First of all, the reason why I don't address that is because as intuitive this idea of different direction of fit is, I'm not entirely sure it is as clean as she think. That there are cases where generally, yeah, we want our belief to fit the world, but sometimes we want to change the world with our belief as well. And on the other hand, yeah, generally when we have intention to do certain things, we want the world to be changed to fit our intention. But sometimes, depends on how the world goes, we would shift our intention too. Like we can set goals. For example, in financial planning, a person could sit down the first section, I want to be a billionaire in 5 days. That's my intention. Well, yeah, I want to change the world so that I can be that. But at the same time, sometimes we change our intention to fit the world. We realize, shit, that's unrealistic. The financial planner would just say, no, you don't have a job. You're knee deep in debt. How can you possibly be a billionaire in 5 days? It's just impossible. So you have to change your intention to be more realistic about things. So that's why, yeah, I think Anscombe is saying something interesting there and talk about there are two different directions of fit. But it's not entirely sure there's a clean cut between like belief, it's one direction, intention is the other. So that's why I think it's an entirely different phenomenon. In itself, it's interesting, the direction of fit thing. But I don't think it fits so neatly to serve the purpose to understand why we have self-knowledge about our own action with our observation. So it's not neat enough for the purpose. So that's what I thought. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Sure. Thank you. So that was the only thing I was thinking about, but I was leaving it for later on. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. And I would just like to point out to everybody in the meeting that if you have some further questions, please signal that in the chat, and you'll be next. And I believe that after Professor Stefanov, we have Ovidiu. Ovidiu, we're all yours.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Cool. Yeah, so thanks, Derek. The talk was great. I really enjoyed it. And I didn't know you had a paper already out, or I didn't know the paper was available. So
it's fresh,
I might
so,
want to look into that. Cool. So yeah, so just two real general questions. So the first regards like the way you kind of handled the pro entitlement argument. So you seem to kind of imply that the only things that the argument could do were like to prove the to offer like proofs or explanations. And I wonder if is your account like really saying these are the only options? So I mean, one could say, well, you know, the guys were just trying to put something on the table, or just trying to, I don't know, bridge some gaps. I mean, or somehow trying to tie the things together, and like discussions of philosophy of mind versus philosophy of actions. And I wonder if you really need to say that the only thing you can do is like offer a proof or an explanation. And that's one thing. And the second thing was just like, again, real general, was that like, is is your account implying that an explanation, as it were, is necessarily causal in the way you like kind of said that, you know, if the explanation is causal, then um, the, the guys you criticized um, kind of messed up the order of causes, right? So is it necessarily that an explanation of that sort has to be like causal? So yeah, so those are my two questions. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much. Those are good questions to help me give me a chance to clarify certain things. So first of all, can there be a third thing? I think it's right that when they present, Luther, for example, present their argument in his paper, he's trying to bridge the gap between philosophy of mind and philosophy of action. They want to say that, well, we can understand the say self-knowledge in action in the same way we understand self-knowledge in philosophy of mind. So that's their intention, to bridge the gap between two fields. But still, an argument has to do something, right? So yeah, same argument applies to two fields, but what are they doing specifically? Actually, from my perspective, my objection applies equally to Birch, I think. So in the paper, I focus on philosophy of action, but actually I think the objection applies to Birch in philosophy of mind as well. So it's just unclear to me what that argument is doing. And I'll just put myself out there. I can't imagine what else an argument can do except as a proof or as an explanation. Like, so I guess my suggestion is either one of them, or if there's a third thing, I want them to say something. If it's not these two, what exactly are you doing? Like presenting an argument is one thing, but I don't know how to engage with an argument until I know what the argument is supposed to do. And what I've shown is that if it is a proof, it would be a bad proof. So presumably you're not trying to prove something to me. And if it is an explanation, it's a terrible explanation. So presumably, if I'm charitable, you're not trying to explain anything to me. So what exactly are you doing here? So basically, that's my question. So my view is, it seems that there's just only two functions. I don't know what the third thing could be, but maybe I'm wrong. So that's something I want to hear more about, either from you or from them. Like, what exactly are you guys trying to do with the argument? So that's a question, more like a half question, half challenge for them. Second question is about whether explanation has to be causal. My answer is no. Actually, when I talk about explanatory order, I use three. There's a fourth one, I think. I dropped it because I think when I presented, I realized it's a terrible example, so I dropped it. So I used three examples. Actually, only the first one is causal, right? For example, when I try to explain my hangover with my party from yesterday, well, that's correct. Well, maybe it's false, but at least the order is right. You're using something in the past, explain something in the future, so you're getting things right. If you do things oppositely, you say, oh, I have hangover because I have a party tomorrow, then I'm messing up order of explanation. So that's one example. That's a causal example, but there are examples where they're not causal. For example, I say, I explain something abstract with something concrete, but not the other way around. I explain why there's a set of Socrates, that's an abstract object. I explain with the existence of Socrates, a concrete object. I can't do it the other way around. I can't explain why certain concrete thing exists by the existence of something abstract. So it's nothing to do with temporal order, because if the set and Socrates exist, they exist at the same time. It's just that the order of explanation is from concrete to abstract, not the reverse. The third example I use is also not a causal explanation. It is what was the third example? Let me check. I forgot. Yes, actually, that's an important example for my purpose. Is that you use fact to explain norms. You explain why you have a duty to save a drowning kid by fact about me, like physiological, biological fact. I can swim. I'm tall enough, I won't drown. These are facts. I use them to explain norms that therefore I have a duty to save the drowning kid. But you can't do the reverse. You can't use my duty to explain facts about me. You can use facts about me to explain what duties I have. So that's another thing about explanatory order. And that's the third explanatory order is exactly the order that the argument messes up. Trying to use what my duty is, what ought to happen to explain what is the case. And I think that is getting the order of explanation wrong. And I think in this case, the order has nothing to do with causation, I presume. So does that make sense?
All right, thank you. I think just to give more time to everybody in the meeting to flesh out a few questions, I'm just going to abuse my chair privilege, Derek, and ask a question of my own. I guess I wholeheartedly agree with you that those are poor arguments. And I guess I tend to also agree with your strategy in dealing with them, but if we just had them up again, if we had the slide back up, if we could just see the agentialist argument, it seemed to me that there were a host of problems with that. So, for instance, one of the problems that sort of jumped eye for me was right. So one of the problems was the conclusion is about self-knowledge, and in particular, knowing what I'm doing. Right? And that particular term doesn't occur in any of the premises.
Yeah, you mean entitlement, the term?
No, I mean, so the conclusion, someone who performs intentional actions must know what intentional actions he or she is performing. Where does the verb know? Oh, it requires knowledge of its product. Right, but so it's not entirely clear to me that, so pardon my nominalist leanings here. It would have been terrific to see precisely how verbatim, right, which part of the premises goes into the conclusion, right? So if we could see that sort of word for word, right? So,
right, you mean more strictly speaking, how does 1, 2, 3 guarantee the conclusion, and I'm presenting it in a very rough way.
Well,
so
I mean,
want to see it more rigorously, which is
you're just trying to sort of walk in the shoes of Burge and sorry, this other fellow whose name I'm blanking out. So one question might be, right, so is knowing, right, what I'm doing the same thing as knowing what the product of rational deliberation is? Right? Is knowing what I'm intending the same as knowing what I'm doing? Is knowing something as a product of rational deliberation the same thing as knowing it as the thing that I'm now performing? So I think there are a host of issues there that and again, I don't think this is you. I think this is just the argument that you're trying to sort of reconstruct from their views, right? So I'm not sure. I was wondering if we could add in a couple more premises here just to make that sort of more explicit, right? And I think the Burge one was even clearer, right? Because there's something about critical examination, and then he jumped to self-awareness, right? Meta-level awareness, right? So why? Well, what's the requiring there, right? So what does it mean that one thing requires the other thing?
Yeah. So thanks. So let's focus on Burge version.
Okay.
There are a lot of detail I skipped. I guess that's the value. Well, I'm sorry to use you guys as lab rat. So that's the value of this practice run. So I know what to cut, what to include if I do this again. So let's focus on Burge version first. I think his version is clearer because it involves less moving parts. And the version that you point to later on, Luther's version about action, is there's a twist in that I did not actually talk about. And yeah, you're right to point it out. It seems to be more unclear, and there's something more happening there. So this is great. It gives me an opportunity to dive into the detail a little bit more. So let's focus on Birch version for the moment. It is clearer. And I think Birch version is clearly valid. And the idea is just that when you're focusing on premise 2, where he says critical reasoning requires meta-level awareness. So by require, he just mean it's an essential component of. So this is how he think about critical thinking. He might be wrong, but I think it's plausible. So I didn't challenge him on, but he might be wrong. So his thought is, look, when you use critical thinking to decide what thought, what belief you could form, it's not just that you generate belief corresponding to or according to certain rules. You need to take a step back from what you're thinking and think about the rules of, say, logic or critical thinking rules, and see what belief you should form. So that's part of what critical thinking is, essentially, according to Birch. You need to take a step back from your thoughts and think about your thought and manipulate your thought in your head. So that's why it's taking a step back to know what's in your head. It's part of what critical thinking is. So that's his thought. And that's what premise 2 is basically about. Well, and so the thought is, if these mental states like belief are product of critical reasoning, and critical reasoning essentially involves you taking a step and look at what mental state you're producing and messing around in your head, the only way you can have these beliefs is for you to know that these beliefs are there. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to produce them by critical thinking. So that's his reasoning. So that's Birch first, and then I'll see if that makes sense, and then I'll move to the action bit, which is more messy. So I'm just curious. First question: are you guys seeing my screen right now?
Yes.
With or without the PowerPoint? Without the PowerPoint.
We're seeing duplicate pictures of ourselves.
Okay, sorry. I'm moving back to PowerPoint. Okay. So that's the Birch part. Does that make sense?
So I have no beef with Burge's positive view of critical thinking. I was just looking at the way the argument's phrased. Mm-hmm. And here it seems as though premise 1 talks about some causal production, right? Mm-hmm. Certain mental states are products of our critical reasoning. Uh-huh. Premise 2 invokes some kind of requirement, and it's not clear whether this is some kind of metaphysical dependence or necessary condition, or whether it's some kind of normative requirement, right? It's simply
good question.
Qualify.
It's not meant to be normative. It's meant to be metaphysical, so to speak. So metaphysically, that's what critical reasoning is. It involves take a step back.
And the conclusions about warrant, right? So however else we might qualify warrant, presumably this is some sort of epistemic modality.
Right. So yeah, okay, you're right. Yeah, I'm careless here. So I'm sort of going back and forth between awareness and knowledge. So when I say meta-level awareness, it's almost like meta-level knowledge. You have to have knowledge about what you're producing with your critical reasoning. And so you're right. Yeah, there are some hidden assumptions here, like, awareness requires knowledge. Knowledge is at least justified, a warranted belief. So there are some hidden assumptions that I probably should add in there.
And is there any sort of assumption that awareness presupposes that the states in question are phenomenal?
Well, what do you mean by that?
By that, I mean phenomenally conscious state.
No, not that I'm aware of. I don't think the argument requires that. I mean, Birch could believe that, but as far as I can tell, this argument does not need any of those. Okay.
And I was just, it just seemed to me that sort of spelling that out a bit could sort of help. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the premise talk about awareness, but then the conclusion talk about warranted or justified belief. It seems to match. Yeah, there's some hidden assumptions that I should flash out better. Yeah, thanks.
I thought I should.
yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, if you're doing going to present an argument by premises and conclusion,
Right.
probably you should do
And
it.
similarly, I wonder if this is connected or not, and please tell me if it isn't. If we just look at the agentialist argument.
Yeah. Okay.
So, what, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I heard you say this, right? So when rational deliberation requires knowledge of its product, this was some sort of there was some sort of normative baggage there, right? It wouldn't be successful deliberation if it didn't sort of bottom out in some sort of knowledge of its product, right? There was some kind of normative assumption. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. So that is a tricky part. Probably I should, when I present this again, cut the earlier part short and spend more time on this. So you're right to notice the normative element. That in the paper I say a little bit more about this. So let me comment on the normative element. So let me think about the order of how I should put this. So first, quick answer to your question. When we said rational deliberation requires knowledge of its product, there's no normative element in that. But this argument consists of some normative element that is absent in Birch's version. So in this agentialist argument, the first premise is a normative claim. Action ought to be product of rational deliberation. So it's different from Birch. Birch is saying that belief, mental states like belief, are product of critical thinking. It's a non-normative claim. But in this case, in the agentialist argument, Luther is making a normative claim. So our action, he's not saying that our actions are product of rational deliberation. He's saying that our action should be product of rational deliberation. We should do that. So of course, it's the reason why he put it this way in a normative way is because whereas Birch want to say all our beliefs, all are product of our reasoning. Maybe our reasoning work poorly. We don't do critical thinking right. Maybe, but at least it's always product of critical reasoning from Birch's perspective. So that's why it's not a normative claim. But from Luther's perspective, action is slightly different. It's that sometimes we do things irrationally. It's just that we ought to do things rationally. We ought to think things through. We ought to take a step back and think about what we do. So that's why the first premise becomes a normative claim, because all he's saying is that our action should be a product of rational deliberation. And that's why we need the premise 2, where he tried to say that, well, if you ought to use practical deliberation, you must be able to use practical deliberation to figure out what you do.
So
that's the normative element added to this argument.
So here's why I was not just a bit unclear, very unclear maybe, about the normative stuff. So premise 1 reads, right, intentional action ought to be products of our rational deliberation, right? And premise 2 reads, if one ought to do X, then one ought to do whatever is necessary for X, or something of the sort.
No, if one ought to do X, if you have a duty to do something, you must be permitted or able to do whatever it takes to do.
Okay, right.
So if you're not allowed to do what it takes to fulfill a duty, you do not have that duty.
Right, but the thought is premise 2 specifies some sort of duty or mentions some sort of duty, right? Whereas premise 1 is an ought to be kind of claim. And typically ought to be differs from ought to do. So we might say, it ought to be the case that there are no poor or sick people in the world, right? But that doesn't mean there's some collective duty that's being implied, and the fact that it ought to be the case that there are no.
I see.
Right. So I was wondering, if those are separate normative elements or if they're supposed to be somehow connected, so I was just wondering how they connect, right?
I see. Okay, that's fair enough. Again, it's sloppiness on my part. Yeah. Would that help if I rephrase the first premise and say, instead of say intentional action ought to be product of rational deliberation, I say intentional action ought to we ought to produce our intentional action by rational deliberation. So it's an ought to do things instead of ought to be.
Right. So that's
Does
what
that
I
help?
thought. But then
Okay, yeah.
that sort of pushed the problem upstairs because it explains knowledge of what I'm doing by some sort of antecedent mental action, namely that I am the deliberator or something of the sort.
But that's not a problem, right? Yeah, the thought is, well, that's exactly the idea, right? They want to explain why you're entitled to form belief about your action. Why? Because you ought to produce them by reasoning.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean,
so the explanation is mental, but they're not using knowledge to explain knowledge. Does that make sense?
I see. Okay, so that means I'm completely misunderstood the first premise because I thought the ought to be there specified some sort of rational requirement that made the intentional action intelligible in light of the rational deliberation I could have carried through, right? So that doesn't presuppose that I will have actually deliberated in any way. And it doesn't presuppose that had I deliberated, I would have been, in some sense, the author of my deliberation, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I get where this is.
Anyway, maybe that's.
I have to think more about it. Maybe, yeah.
But
Maybe what's happening is that this argument is terrible in more than one way. And I am very skeptical of this kind of approach, this kind of sometimes people call this transcendental approach. I never understand what this label means in this context. So I know what can't mean, but when people say this is a transcendental argument, I don't know what the hell are they talking about. So maybe there are like more than one reason why this is a bad argument, and you're getting at like a slightly different.
I think that's likely true. Yeah. Ovidio, I think, had a follow-up. Ovidio, please.
You're muted. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, I didn't want to follow up with anything.
We can hear you now.
I think he said he actually don't have a question.
Oh, sorry. Is that what you said? I must have misunderstood that. I thought that was a follow-up question. I'm bad with acronyms, so okay.
Oh, by the way, I just want to mention I'm happy to digress from this paper. If there's anything that's related to self-knowledge that maybe the talk sort of inspire you to think about, I'm happy to chat about that as well.
Okay. Well, let's just see if there are any further questions, and if not, we'll wait 1 or 2 more minutes as I bug you with some of my own questions, Derek. But let's see if there are any further questions from maybe someone who is not me. Okay. Wow, we have a new we have a new audience member. Okay, so Derek, let me very quickly switch to a question about your explanatory order bit, right? So I was wondering why you need it, right? So it seemed to me as though you only need, and maybe this is wrong, right? But it seemed to me as though you only need something like, well, you don't explain what's clear through or by means of what's more obscure, right? Or you don't explain sort of what's more epistemically immediate via what's less epistemically immediate, or something of the sort, right? That seems to be why we tend to explain norms by facts. That seems to be why we tend to explain sort of abstract things by whatever happens to concreta. That seems to be why we tend to explain, what came after by means of what came before. If we had that sort of simple-minded, don't explain what's obvious in terms of what's entirely obscure, right? wouldn't that have been enough to challenge the agentialist argument?
So let me get this right. You're trying to, so there's something I did not try to do and you're trying to do. So when I talk about explanatory order, I listed out 3 and potentially 4 examples where the idea of explanatory order seems to be at work. And you are proposing a way to unify them. You're saying that all these cases involve that we need to use something that's clearer to explain what's obscure. You're saying that all those cases are unified under this banner. That's what you're trying to do, is it? And that's something that I did not try to do because that seems to be much more controversial. All I'm saying is there's this idea of explanatory order. Here's some example. Is there a general theory of what explanatory order is? I don't know. And you have offered one. Is that what you're trying to do? And once you have that theory of explanatory order, you can apply it to the agentialist argument and show why they are getting the order wrong because they're trying to use something that's obscure to explain what's clear. Is that what you're trying to do?
Well, I think you've laid it out quite neatly. So I wasn't necessarily looking for some generality by way of every and all possible explanations. But it seems to me that suppose we had this principle, right, which could very well be questioned and so on.
Yeah, I don't think it's true. I'm sorry.
Right. I mean, I agree with you. It's not generally true, but the question is, I thought, with respect to your talk here, couldn't it possibly be true with respect to what the agentialist is interested in? Right. So couldn't it possibly be true with respect to attempts to explain one's knowledge of what one's doing?
On second thought, while you're articulating your question, on second thought, I would say it's an intriguing thought, but I don't think it would work. So here's the reason why I think that it wouldn't work. When you're trying to explain why a person has entitlement to believe something, for example, from Birch's perspective, he thinks that kids are entitled to believe things based on their perception. A kid sees their mom, they believe, oh, it's mom. Totally entitled to form that belief. And here's something interesting about entitlement is that the kid don't need to have any conceptual resources to articulate something about the perception, the relation between his belief and perception. None of that is necessary. So it seems that the belief that mom is here is clear. Facts about his perceptual system and relation to belief system is obscure from his perspective. Yet the explanation of the beliefs of Warren is based on something obscure for him. So that's why it's unclear to me that the kind of explanation we're seeking when it comes to epistemic entitlement has to be something that's from clear to obscure. Sometimes we can use something obscure that we're not clear about to explain something that we already know is there clearly. So that's why I'm not sure that this would be something that worries them.
Right, but do you think that what's going on in this case, you mentioned the child example and so on, do you think what's important there is the fact that there's some kind of that there's some not fully developed conceptual repertoire, or is it that were such a conceptual repertoire to be developed, it would be more obscure than what it seeks to explain? Right.
From the perspective of people talking about epistemic entitlement, people don't need the conceptual repertoire to articulate the basis of the entitlement. And even if they had the concepts, they don't need to be able to put the concepts together.
Right.
Like to form beliefs about perception, I don't need to have the concept of perception. And even if I have the concept of perception, I don't need to be able to articulate why I am allowed to form belief based on perception, right? So that's a thought.
Right. I was just wondering whether the obscurity there was just an artifact of concepts missing or something. Well, anyway. So great. Let's see if, and by the way, Derek, I'm going to pester you with this further on, but
Yeah,
I
sure,
want
of
to
course.
keep everybody in the meeting.
Yeah, we know each other.
If, yes, well, any further questions for Derek or? Okay, well, Derek, I would like to thank you on behalf of everybody. This has been quite terrific. I mean, please drop by anytime.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to be able to present overseas with this online thing. This is a new experience for me. I hope it's not too annoying for you guys. It is weird. I can't see people presenting. It's weird. It's very weird. I don't know whether you guys are following, whether I'm explaining things enough. So it's very weird for me. So I hope I did something. I hope you guys enjoy part of it at least. And I have my email on the slide, and Andre know how to reach me. So if you have anything that you want to talk about, I'm happy to. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Derek. And next Monday, 6 p.m., we will be hearing from Lavinia Magin from TU Delft. And Lavinia will be speaking. I don't have the exact title in front of my eyes, but she will be speaking about the possibility of enhancing critical thinking skills in an online environment. So it's going to be an interesting extended cognition talk that we're very eager to hear. Derek, thanks again. This has been truly wonderful, and we'll chat again soon.
Sure.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you.